Just as we're undergoing changeover here, my name's Arn Keeling. I'm a geographer at Memorial University, and I'm here with Ann Dance, who is a ReSDA postdoc working with us on this project. And I'm just going to say a few words by way of introduction and then turn it over to Ann. We're at the very outset of this project on environmental impacts of resource development and their impacts on community engagement around those questions. The origin of our interest in this is I collaborate a lot with a historian at Memorial University, John Sandloss, and we had a long project that was interested in the historical geography of mining in the Canadian North. As John Thistle yesterday illustrated, we actually already know in some ways a lot about mining in the North because it's not a new. We have at least 100 years of experience of large-scale industrial mining at different sites across the North. Of course, under very different regulatory regimes, different political conditions, different levels of empowerment of Aboriginal communities. But nevertheless, in the Abandoned Mines in Northern Canada project, we were interested in looking at some of this record and in particular capturing the local community and the Indigenous experience of these past mining episodes, which in the literature had not been very well explored whatsoever. So we did a lot of oral history projects, collaborative work, etc. With First Nations from Keno Hill to Yellowknife, Port Radium, Shepherville, a whole series of major historical sites. One of the issues that came out of this site, of this work, was the realization that while many of these mines had closed, mining had ceased, in some cases communities had basically been vaporized from, like Pine Point, from the map, nevertheless, there were ongoing effects of past mining that would persist for decades after. These included the social and economic impacts and sometimes people's social memories around the experience of mining and of mine closure, which is a topic that in the, again, the push for development and the expectations that Ben talked about is never talked about enough. But also the environmental legacies of many of these projects persisted long after. Sometimes because of neglect and poor practices by the companies, but even in some cases where mine sites were in fact remediated according to the standard of the day, the long-term landscape and environmental impacts of these places could be serious issues for local communities and for local land users. So we started referring to these sites as zombie mines, mines that, although seemingly dead, in fact had this long-term afterlife that local communities in particular had to deal with. Thus, we've become, in particular, interested in questions around environmental remediation, the cleanup of sites, the planning for closure, the planning for the management of long-term environmental legacies, which may be toxic legacies, like the 237,000 tons of arsenic trioxide that are buried under Giant Mine, or they may be landscape issues, they just may be plain old tailings management. We learned one thing from the Mount Polly disaster in British Columbia, it's that even supposedly the sand that is associated with tailings at mine sites can present long-term and ongoing management problems. So with that, we've got a ReSDA-funded project beginning to look at questions around environmental legacies, remediation, and how communities themselves can articulate their concerns and their participation in that planning. So I'll turn it over to Ann, who's going to be leading that project for us.
Right. Yes. Well, thank you for that. I think it really is a really important and fascinating topic. And thank you also to ReSDA for funding us and inviting us here. I've really, really enjoyed chatting with people over food, in the breaks. It's been wonderful to be here and to be in Goose Bay. So next slide, thank you. So I'm going to make this very quick. I started 3.5 weeks ago at Memorial. So I don't have
It is early days.
Yes, very early days. And 1 week of the last month was in Stockholm. There was a conference there. So I don't have a lot of results to present, but there are some ideas. And again, it's sort of a to-be continued issue. And if I'm going wrong, as Ben asked after his presentation, if there are things that I'm not addressing here that are important, and you have questions about that, or you say, you should be doing this, let me know. And I have my contact details at the end for that, or we can chat after. Yes, so this is what I'll be doing. And I also want to thank the people who who I had dinner with last night, who helped me sort of completely re-envision this presentation, so that was great. My background is that I have researched remediation and reclamation for my PhD. I looked at the Athabasca oil sands and issues around that. I'd previously been doing history and policy, and I was just astonished by the lack of real conversations about what landscapes would look like post-reclamation and before that post-extraction. And we were talking about this yesterday, this gap between what we hear in policy making and what's actually coming from the communities, their concerns, their worries, and their plans. There's a huge gap. So here, this is me in Sydney, Nova Scotia, because I also looked at the Sydney tar ponds. And this is sort of an ongoing research interest of mine, and it's really great to work with Arn and John and everybody at Memorial. Jeanette's here somewhere as well. It's a really good team. We have a mining group. We meet every 2 weeks to discuss these issues, and it's been super so far. So next slide, please. Right, so as I said, I'm 3 weeks in, so I don't have any results. But there are some really big themes that, from my PhD research and from the literature I've read so far, will probably come out in this project. And again, it might change, but they're ones I want to talk about because they really relate to everything we've discussed so far. So what exactly is remediation? If you look up the policy documents from 60 years ago, remediation was defined as something very differently from what we describe now. I mean, it was basically resurfacing, planting something, hoping it grows, and sort of abandoning the site, or not doing any remediation at all. So I think there's an opportunity here to redefine remediation in that it should be community-driven definitions of what we're trying to do. And there are all these elements that are not connected, as Arn said. So how does wildlife fit into remediation? Are IBAs considering this? And quite often they're not. So how can we address that? And then also reclaiming remediation, so redefining it. If it's changed so much in the last 50 years, why can't it change even more to be much more inclusive and much more community-driven? I think there's a lot of interest in that from what I've read so far. And then the temporal dimension, Arn got into these, so the idea of zombie mines, and the long-term uncertainty around how safe is this site. Can my children play near it? Probably not, but how much information does the community have, and how that information has to be accessible. And the whole process around that can be very fraught and difficult and not acceptable. And then finally, what happens next? How can we make these sites in policy, but how can it be community-driven in terms of how these sites are used following reclamation, and how can plans actually incorporate that? So those are issues that there are some papers being written on them now, some really good work, and that's something that I'll be looking at. And I wanted to include this little image of the Syncrude's predictions of what the oil sands would look like following reclamation. It's something I found in the Provincial Archives of Alberta. But I think it's really useful in that it sort of shows this wetland that maybe doesn't look very pleasant, and then there's mining, and then there's sort of this land resurfacing, and it looks even better after reclamation. But this is this misconception in policymaking. You frequently come across this idea that reclamation is restoration, or is actually improving. It's a form of improvement, and that is not the case. And that was something that really came up in my oil sands research. But I always like sharing that because I think it is quite important to sort of look at it and question it. So next slide, thanks.
Just 1 minute.
Yeah, okay. So these are the questions I'm going to look into. Issues around improving community involvement, governance and oversight. What are the mitigation measures that work? What are the mitigation measures that don't work? How can remediation projects actually engage with Indigenous peoples and TDK? What's the role of science and expert knowledge? Frequently, if you look at hearings, there's a lot of confusion over industry presentations about what reclamation can and can't do. And so the language around that has to change, and how can that happen? And then also historical memory, big issue, and what are the financial securities and how has that changed over time. So next slide. So this is my plan. It's a one-year postdoc. It's going to be pretty intense and pretty great. And I should have a report in the spring. Just that's something to look for. And then there'll be an academic paper out of it. But the real focus, I think, is doing a report looking at what's happening and ways to move forward. Next slide, thanks. Yeah, so I was at this conference in Stockholm 2.5 weeks ago, and it was really interesting in that there were a lot of historians and scientists and people working on mine remediation in the circumpolar north, and I really found that a lot of the issues that we discuss in our mining group and so on around sort of long-term remediation strategies and how can community input actually appear in remediation plans and shape remediation plans, those came up. So in conclusion, so next slide, thanks. I think the main thing to take away from this is that remediation offers an opportunity for what Kelsey talked about yesterday. How can we have these essential basic expectations for what will happen next in terms of how clean it will be, how safe it will be. And this is a project that looks at how we can get there.